Hello, everybody. I think you can hear me. I think there's still one person that is joining. Okay, we should be all there. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much for participating. So, as you know, this panel is the first of 3 sessions. It's organizing 3 sessions, one this afternoon, one tomorrow morning, and one tomorrow afternoon. And it is titled Shifting South, Governance of Regional Value Chains, Social Standards, and COVID-19. As the title suggests, the core topic, I'm still admitting people whilst we speak, the core topic is regional value chains. There has been a growth in South-South trade and in regional value chains in the Global South. That is something that is critical, that has informs our panel. And as such, we are looking at different aspects that surround this shift, if you want, in the global scenario of global value chains and regional value chains. We want to look at the governance of regional value chains. That includes private governance, social governance, as well as public governance, aspects of gender, workers' rights, as well as the impact of COVID-19 on this scenario. So with no further, I'm going to leave the floor to Stephanie, who's going to chair the first session. And yeah, Stephanie, over to you.
Welcome to everyone. We've got some very interesting papers in this session. As a sort of, when we grouped my name's Stephanie Barrientos, sorry, I'm at University of Manchester, co-organizer of the session with Giovanni and Matthew Alford. When we organised the papers, this session was broadly around the theme of governance. The next two will be more broadly around the theme of labour, just to sort of group them in that way. So we've got 4 great papers. I won't introduce all of them now. We're going to go in the order in which they're on the agenda, but I think I will give the presenters a quick reminder of time, just in case that they're getting a little bit off track or not keeping an eye on that, which is not always easy when you're presenting. So what we're going to do is we're going to have 15-minute presentations, 5-minute Q&A for each paper, and then at the end we want to leave some time for discussion across the papers and across the broader theme of global value chains and decent work and that change that is evolving inside global value chains or along through global value chains. So the first paper is going to be presented by Serena Massino on unbalanced governance and workers' adverse incorporation and multi-scalar analysis of the Ghanaian construction sector. So Serena, thank you.
Thanks for the introduction. So I'm presenting a study that I co-authored with my 2 colleagues, Nadia and Mavis, who are not here today, specifically on how the very rapid internationalization of the construction sector is affecting workers' incorporations and incorporation outcomes for workers. Construction sectors, not just in Ghana, but across really the African continent, have been booming both from the point of view of real estate development and infrastructure development. And we see this being driven largely by the participation of so-called new emerging economies. So for example, the sector was the most highly invested by China worldwide in the years 2016 to 2017, the construction sector. And so in Ghana specifically, it made up 1/3 of the total national investment value in 2017. And as well as sort of responding to increasing urbanization pressures, it also made up, on average, 50% of the total new employment created between 2008 and 2017. So that's quite a lot. There's quite a bit of fluctuations. We will talk about the cyclicality of projects, construction projects in a minute, but 50% is obviously very high. So the question is now, this expansion of operations across the continent and in Ghana specifically is generating quite a lot of employment incorporation, but what type of employment, what type of incorporation? The sector is vertically integrated and although it is vertically integrated, it isn't export oriented, and it doesn't have much participation or scrutiny happening from the international side or from the civil society side. So there's no NGOs to speak of or end user awareness. This makes it quite different from most of the sectors that the GPN literature has really focused on, which is mostly horticulture or garment manufacturing. So, which is surprising because obviously it's a sector where we're seeing massive expansion, but there isn't really much that we know about workers' incorporation there, apart from a few exceptions. So we're going to try and take a mixed method analysis and multi-scalar perspective to look at it from a qualitative and quantitative point of view and connect the transnational, national to the sectoral construction level and the workplace level itself. Just to give you a brief introduction of what the findings are going to look like, we're going to be talking about a composite governance architecture where there are 3 parallel processes that sort of are cascading down to the workplace level to determine the incorporation of workers. And we find that this governance architecture is unbalanced in that there is a section that is entirely missing. The governance processes led by the state and by firms are not counterbalanced in any way by the presence of civil society or international involvement. We will see how this is playing out. The state specifically is identified, it's sort of emphasized as having an interscalar mediator role. So using the taxonomy proposed by Marion Phillips and Horner, it's facilitated regulatory buyer and political will functions are essentially mediating this cascading process down to the workers. Just very briefly on the sample, so we have about we have 30 companies and 305 individuals. The data was collected over 4 years between 2015 and 2019. Firms have been selected and classified according to ownership, activities, and size. Specifically for the ownership, we've followed Morrison Starrett and classified them as either wholly foreign owned, and so these are companies coming from all over the world in our sample, or domestic, or we have joint ventures, or the so-called diasporic. So these are firms that are quite recurrent in a number of African countries where they are owned by individuals that were perhaps even born in the country but retain strong ties to their international origins. So these companies are usually quite different because they have access to international capital. Activities divided in either real estate or infrastructure or both, and sizes are the large, medium, or small, depending on the number of employees. The employees, on the other hand, are rather unskilled, semi-skilled, skilled employees of companies, managers of companies, or policymaking or institutional respondents. The sample, especially at the unskilled level, is mostly male-dominated, as is probably understandable being the construction sector. And then we further divide, we identify permanent, temporary, and casual contracts. So the analysis will hinge of this division quite a bit. Now, the qualitative part of the analysis is probably the broadest and the one that is richest in detail, but we also have an exploratory multi-level analysis where we're exploring only the workplace and firm level, so the individual worker and firm level, and leaving out the other 3, which are obviously staying constant in a regression analysis. So what we find here is that workers with the highest probability of being adversely incorporated are the ones which are less skilled on casual contracts, working firms that subcontract the most, so subcontract intensively, and or do not allow unions. No big surprises here, probably. What we can quantify, though, is the fact that firm level factors account for up to 72% of the adverse incorporation, and individual worker related factors only up to the 28%. So that's quite interesting. Now, the tendency to subcontract is across the board and across all dimensions found to be the most important determinant of adverse incorporation. This is something that you can see in this. So I've been trying to remove this black panel here, but I'm not entirely sure. I'm probably doing something wrong. What you can see in these 4 panels anyway is that all companies, these are foreign, newly arrived, foreign with the longest permanence in the country, and domestic in green. All of them have very similar trajectories in terms of the impact of subcontracting, regardless of whether they're newly arrived, they've been in the country for long, they're domestic. Apart from one case, subcontracting really cuts across all dimensions in its negative impact. Something else that that graph is showing you is that ownership, the origin of this ownership in and of itself, isn't terribly important. What is more important is whether companies have been in the country for a long time or not. If they have been in Ghana for a long time, they tend to be related to better working conditions, to better labor standard outcomes. Again, this might seem like not as a surprise, and in fact, in the very scant literature that we have in the construction sector, we find something very similar in Oya. That's all. But what is important to emphasize here is that, however, we can't really rely entirely on this concept of firms that have been in the country for long, because that would be an oversimplification. Crucially, what we find in our sample, which is quite broad, it's like 30 companies, it's quite broad, is the complexity overrides that dimension. So just to give you a few examples, what really matters is the interaction of the company's own corporate culture with the way they, the home related labor standards and host country labor standards interact within the activity of that firm. How do they mediate home country, host country labor standards and their own corporate culture? So first of all, there's an overlap between length of permanence of the company and its size. Companies that have been in the country for longest tend to be, not all, but tend to be bigger. Companies that are bigger obviously find it harder to fly under the radar, and this means that they normally guarantee better labor standards at the workplace level. But then on the other hand, we found companies that had just arrived in Ghana, like very recently arrived, they were guaranteeing the best labor standards we found across the board already from the start of their operations. And on the other end of the spectrum, companies that had been in Ghana for a very long time that became more knowledgeable about loopholes in the regulations. So essentially, what we want to emphasize here is that there's a concern that regardless of whether the ownership is from, firms may operate in the host location at or nearer the lowest common denominator the domestic policies allow when their own home country labor legislations are not tying them to superior standards. So what we are really emphasizing here, it doesn't matter where they're coming from or where they're going to, but the interaction of these two dimensions, how far off they are from each other, and how do they sort of limit, put boundaries around the corporate culture of a company is what matters. So each company is going to have a very different outcome depending on how these three factors interact. This is one of the processes that we are including in our governance structure. Another process is the one that sort of led by the state and by the outsourcing that the state is doing towards the market. So it is widely known that states have facilitated adverse incorporation of workers through the 80s and 90s with the structural adjustment policies. But now within the context of Ghana, what we're also seeing is that essentially, sorry, there's a typo on the slide. The labor control function is essentially being outsourced to markets through the subcontracting that is taking place extensively.
About 5 minutes, just.
Thanks. And there's a missing political will to change this, because essentially the 2003 Ghana Labour Act hasn't been reformed, especially this section, subcontracting, since then. So there's a process ongoing, but it never gets completed. So essentially the subcontracting legislation doesn't tie workers, casual workers, informal workers to lead firms. They're always only ever going to be labor agencies and brokers that are responsible for them. This cuts them out entirely of obviously benefits, allowances, and even access to unionization. I will probably skip a bit on the buyer. I can come back on that if there are any questions on that. So essentially what we are seeing here is that this pervasiveness of subcontracting in the construction sector is creating a spatial fragmentation where the employment arrangement has this disjunction, this is taken from Wills, between workers, the lead firm, and their real employer, which is often in disguise. Now, what is missing here, what is missing to put any check on these two processes, the process of outsourcing coming from the public sector and the process of heterogeneity around firms' characteristics, is any type of social or international governance intervention. There aren't even codes of conduct to speak of led by industry. So, and the state once again is missing any type of political will to support the very few social initiatives that we identified coming from independent trade unions or social enterprises. I will go very quickly over the unions. So unions are very rare. Only 7 companies out of 30 allow them. There was often intimidation going on, and then the pervasiveness of informality. So this quote comes from a worker. The work here is contract based. There's no time for workers to plan for unions. This captures a lot of what I saw in the field. Essentially, I can talk more about that. So now I want to show you this graph. This is essentially picturing what we've been talking about. So the red segment is the outsourcing one. So we have global commercial driver pressures leading to intensive outsourcing at the national state level. So the rays are the different multi-scalar levels. At the national state, there's missing subcontracting legislation that mediates these pressures. So these pressures immediately go onto the markets and to the cascading process that goes from the lead firm to the initial subcontractors and all the following subcontractors down to the very informal labor brokers. So the workers obviously are at the very end of this process. The blue segment is this heterogeneity mediated by, that occurs with the interaction of home country labor-related regulations, host country labor regulations, and the established subcontracting practices that are not specific to Ghana or to Africa. I mean, it even happens in the UK. Subcontract is a mainstay of the construction sector everywhere. But even more so, then it's important to see how is this translating then into worker outcomes. And then there's
about 2 minutes.
Yeah, thanks. And then there's the interaction of these 2 levels with the corporate culture of firms, which varies firm by firm. The segment that is white is the one that's missing. So here, trade agreements, global framework agreements, codes of conduct, support for civil society initiatives are completely missing, as are NGOs or end user involvement. Okay, so there's this imbalance with the architecture being entirely determined by the other 2 rays. Now, just a couple of concluding remarks on potential policy relevant points, which I can expand on perhaps if there are any questions. We saw the size is quite important in determining better worker labor standards outcomes. Should perhaps a policy recommendation be drawn around this? Like, does it mean that we should try to attract bigger firms over smaller ones? The main points really are one about the reform of the Labour Act and the understanding of why this isn't happening, essentially, and the second about the need for involvement of different actors in the governance process, which at the moment is entirely missing. So how can we raise awareness in the other segments of society to make sure that they are also participating in the process? And I think that's it for me.
Thank you very much, Serena. That's really interesting and dead on to time. We've already got one question, which Shane Godfrey, do you want to just ask your question, Shane? Because you might want to expand on it. And please either put questions in the chat or put your hand up, whichever you prefer.
Hi, Serena. Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Hi. I just wanted to know, you referred to workers being adversely incorporated, and
yeah.
I didn't know what you meant by that, because I mean, I understand firms being adversely incorporated into value chains, but not workers.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. So I mean, essentially, so that I think it's a bit of what I was saying. Like, so you can get a job. What we find is that often workers will say, well, at least I've got a job. So they are incorporated. Previously, if those foreign companies, or in general, like, you know, the newer activities that have been expanded by the foreign presence of lead firms, they wouldn't have been able to get a job at all. So now they've got a job. What type of job do they have, though? So does having a job limit their vulnerability, or does it even increase it? One thing that I had to skip over because of time is this dimension of almost inbuilt vulnerability in the construction sector, which comes from the fact that all construction projects come to an end normally. So companies and employees, they are never on business forever permanently, because there's always a project that ends. Now, whether a company has another project that comes up straight after that one, that's what determines whether you move from one contract to another. Skilled workers will normally be retained and move from one contract to another, but for unskilled workers, it's not like that. They will just be dismissed. So there's that dimension which is inbuilt in the construction sector of vulnerability. And then there's the other one, that they are just essentially hired daily by labor brokers. So this comes with a great deal of vulnerability. They're not included in any type of union representation, no benefits, no allowances, no social safety nets. So they are incorporated in the chain, but the conditions associated with that can arguably be said to be increasing their vulnerability rather than decreasing it. This would be the idea.
Great, thank you. I think we've got a follow-up question from Matthew Alford.
Yeah, thanks for a fantastic presentation, Serena. I really, as you say at the beginning, I learned a lot about a sector that is relatively understudied. Just following on from Shane slightly, and then I'll ask a different question. The notion of adverse incorporation, I know you probably refer back to Nicola Phillips, some of her work with that, and how she conceptualizes precarious workers, particularly as adversely incorporated. I'm still, like Shane, I'm still wondering if there were any particular features of working conditions or typology that you use to kind of pin down and define which aspects of work were you deemed adverse. It seems to me from your later slide, a lack of union representation or enabling rights were one key aspect, but I was just wondering if there was a particular typology. And the second quick question I have as well is you also talked about the construction GPN and referred to the fact that a lot of the domestic firms, lead firms themselves were based in Ghana. So it was if that makes sense. I'm just wondering in layman terms, if you could describe what the construction GPN looks like, because I wasn't entirely sure. Like, who are the buyers? What are the linkages that you see between supplier, buyer? They were my two main questions. Sorry for the waffle. Great. I really enjoyed the presentation. Thanks a lot.
Thanks. So yes, obviously, like I couldn't go into a great deal of detail about how we categorize adverse incorporation. So in the paper, which I don't think I have circulated, but I can do, we use answers of workers to a number of questions to categorize that the type of adverse incorporation. So as you said, labor union is one, and then there's obviously whether they have access to social safety nets, so whether the social contributions are being paid for them or not. Whether they form part of a pension fund, whether they get any type of lunch accommodation, traveling support. So the answers to this categorizes them as 1, 2, or 3. So we have vector, which we're using, and so this one defines the 3 categories essentially. And then, as with regards to your second question, yes. So on the GPN, okay. So what we see in the construction sector is obviously we have, let's say, 3 typologies coexisting. We have the fully domestic companies, then we have these hybrid diasporic companies where so the company is registered in Ghana, but because the owner retains links with abroad, there will be another partner company somewhere abroad. Part of the furniture, because the furniture isn't produced in Ghana, so part of the fixtures, furnitures, glass, and other components of building will be imported from abroad into Ghana. And some of those companies also have a marginal hub, so original hub production. The lead firms, so that the entirely foreign-owned sector will mainly operate with a headquarter somewhere in Brazil, in Portugal, in Abu Dhabi. They have a lead company there that has sub branches that sort of like branch out, and then they have regional hubs where they're investing. So those companies are directly reporting to that. And then they have locally, they will have, it really depends. I mean, so it's very varied, but they will have supplies of cement, for example. So some will take the cement from home, some will take it from locally, some will take the furniture from abroad. Very few try to create something from local timber. So there will be networks of supplying depending on the nature. So if it's real estate versus infrastructure, obviously.
Great,
Yeah.
thanks very much, Serena. Soren, I can see you've got a really good question in the chat box in relation to the state. Can I ask that we park that question for the moment, just in the interest of time, that all the papers get time to present. But we will come back. But please, you'll be the first one in the broader discussion, because I think that's a question that would relate probably to most of the papers in one way or another. If
That's
okay.
fine. Yeah, that's fine, Steph.
Okay, Giovanni, would you like to go ahead, and Serena, can you take yours down, and then Giovanni can put his presentation up.
Yeah, as soon as, yeah.
Serena, can you
I've
take?
also muted myself. I think so. I have paused the sharing. Your screen sharing is stop sharing. Sorry, there you go.
Stop sharing
Sorry.
if you need, yeah.
Yeah.
Fine.
Okay, 1 second.
So again, just for those who joined late, it's 15 minutes per presentation, 5 minutes Q&A, but we've left time at the end for a discussion across all the papers.
Okay, can everybody see and hear me? Stephanie is fine.
I can hear you fine, and I can see you.
And brilliant. Okay, so this paper, which I co-wrote with Shane Godfrey, who is also among the participants, is on the governance of Eswatini, previously known as Swaziland, apparel regional value chains, before COVID-19. And then we look at how this governance structure of the value chains have very much impacted and shaped the way in which COVID-19 affected the sectors and the workforce. It is also already published recently, very recently published as an article, and you can find it at the link. I'm going to share the link later to on the chat. So I want to start first by saying that the apparel industry is probably one of the most researched industry in global value chains and global production networks, in manufacturing at least, largely because it has been one of the very first to globalize back in the 70s, and largely driven by this north-south divide, where big brands in the global north have outsourced production to developing countries, to firms, to suppliers in developing countries. So most of this literature is very much looking at this north-south divide and the interaction and the governance of these value chains between lead firm and suppliers. What we're doing here, and that kind of literature, I can't summarize it here, of course, because it is enormous, it's a lot, but if I were to put out a slide, this is probably the one I would show, which is, it comes from a study by Mark Hanner, Jennifer Bear, 2013, and Blasi, 2013. And what this is showing really is the process of what Mark Hanner calls the squeezing down and sucking up. So you have the squeezing down of workers and sucking up of values by lead firms in the global north. And the columns represent the unit values that the US on average pay for a unit of clothing, in this case, a square meter of clothing that they import from developing countries. So these are lead firms importing clothing that then they sell in the US. As you can see, the blue columns, the price has been going down, meaning that lead firms have been paying less and less for the same amount of clothing. As the price has been going down, the red line, which is a workers' rights index, has also, in these developing countries, in these firms, has also been dropping. And that's not the case because, of course, if you can, if you receive a lower price for whatever you're producing, you either cut on labor costs, and if you can't cut on labor costs because of minimum wages, you will then end up having to increase efficiency and making workers produce more in less time, which turns into sometimes inhumane conditions in most of these factories. And this is very much the story of unsustainability of the sector over time, over the last 40 years. And recent research has also shown that in this north-south global value chains, COVID-19 has accelerated this trend much more than what we were already seeing. But what we're interested in this paper is regional value chains in the global south, and specifically the case of Eswatini. As you can see in this figure, is easy to understand why. Whereas Eswatini for quite a while was an exporter of garment to the global north, to the States, that's the orange line. It now does not export anything anymore to the US, whereas most of its industry has shifted to supply the South African market within a South-South regional value chains effectively. Eswatini is a very tiny country, right? We are talking about 20 firms that constitute the entire population universe of firms there. A total of 22,000 direct employed people, much more if you also look at that indirect employment. And apparel constitutes about 10 to 12%, 11% of the country's total export. And despite having shifted away from serving the United States, you can see that the industry has been growing a lot until COVID-19. So our research points to two main governance structures existing in the industry. The first one is the governance structure characterized by what we call direct suppliers. That pretty much is very similar to what most of you already know from studies of global value chains with firms in developing countries serving brands in the global north. You have this large, for the case of Eswatini, we have large retailers based in South Africa of the kind of Foschini, Woolworths, and Truworths that interact directly with suppliers in Eswatini, and they have direct contracts with them. Contract that establish what is produced, how much is produced, where it is produced, how, all the specifications, and so on. So it's very much a direct interaction. Most of the firms, we say, is about 6 to 8 firms, because 2 firms operate across value chains. So is a large and mid-sized free on board producers, as well as large CMT, cut, make, and trim units. The other group of firms, which is about 12 to 14, is driven by South African discount retailers. For those of you who are familiar with the market in South Africa, we're talking about Pepkor, Pep Market, Pep stores, Mr. Price, and what was previously known as Adcon, and now it's been acquired by other firms. This is an agent-driven value chain. It means that these big discount retailers do not interact directly with the suppliers. Instead, they operate through third parties, which are known as design houses, that then interact with the suppliers. So it's really almost a triangulation where the suppliers and the buyers do not meet each other, do not have a contract. Most of these firms are small CMT units. They do some outsourcing, so they further outsource to other firms, but this is completely unchecked and not audited. So what was the situation before COVID-19? This data comes from a survey of all 20 firms we did in July 2019, so before COVID. I'm just providing here some of the data that we collected. So if you looked at auxiliary functions, so functions beyond cut, make, and trim that are performed by the firm, you can see that direct suppliers perform many more functions vis-a-vis indirect suppliers. They're more likely to operate as FOB, free on board firms, which means they have control on upstream phases of the value chain, textile sourcing largely, which normally allows them also to capture higher shares of value added. They are more likely to implement private standards, and private standards goes all across. Here we're talking largely about quality standard, but also environmental and social compliance. As a result, their markups are about double the markups that we see for indirect suppliers. When it comes to labor entitlements, again, before COVID-19, we can see that these firms, direct suppliers, are more likely to carry out social audits. These social audits are carried out by third parties, can be the buyers, so the lead firm, or a third-party agency. They are about a similar likelihood of being unionized, however, a higher one to have a collective bargaining agreement in place with the union. They are more likely to hold workers' meetings on a regular basis within the firm. to have a clinic available to workers, and to have a gender discrimination policy in place. Although it's important to notice that this share is still quite slow, it's still quite low vis-a-vis the entire population, right? So COVID-19 comes in, and our data we are using here is again disaggregated trade data for the first 3 months of the pandemic, starting in March 2020. And for the first 3 months, what we find is that the total export of Eswatini of apparel compared to the previous year is about 45% less. And this is not a surprise. Firms were closed for about half of the time during these 3 months. The rest of the time they were operating almost at a 50% capacity. So that's the kind of figure we would expect to see. However, there's something more interesting there. If we look at average unit values, which is what we were looking at the very first slide, right? We saw the average unit values have been declining in north-south value chains. Well, here we can see that COVID has accelerated this decline in a way for indirect suppliers with a drop of about 15%, which is quite substantial. Whereas for direct suppliers, it has remained the same. In fact, it increased by about 4%. And I will, in a second, tell you why it increased. So
you've got about 5 minutes.
Thank you. So here is a quote from the Employer Association president: "Companies that do business with intermediaries, they are being squeezed as intermediaries try to get them to sell the same products at lower prices. Many members complained about this." So the other big aspect is a shift to PPE production. If we look at the average number of items exported by firms over this 3 months period we looked at, indirect suppliers kept the exact same number of products, of course, lower value, so lower total export, but the number of products they were exporting is the same. For direct suppliers, there has been an increase. Why? Because they shifted to PPE. So we got an opportunity to get into producing PPE, and that allowed us to keep working, first for the local market and also for export to South Africa. This is what the direct suppliers told us. So when it comes to labor entitlements, as of July 2020, the entire workforce was employed on 50% shifts, right? So workers were paid only for the time worked. And of course, that means that the income they had was halved. If you consider that a machinist on average in the country earns about $116 per month, which is already significantly below the country's living wage, well, if you take 50% of that, you understand that it's practically unlivable. And it already is a disaster from that perspective. Yet this, again, we see some unequal impact across direct and indirect suppliers. Largely from a qualitative perspective, we can see that direct suppliers have received some support from their buyers, financial through loans and through anticipated payments, as well as through PPE orders, which effectively allow them to keep producing and hence pay workers. And also, when it comes to public governance, that's also quite important. The government of Eswatini had at least 3 tools available to deal with this issue, but they have been largely ineffective. The first one is a trust where each firm is supposed to pay the first month of each employee wage as they hire the employee. However, many apparel firms over years were given exemption to this as part of an investment policy of the country to attract FDIs, meaning that when they turned to this trust, there was literally very little money, if no money in it. The second one is the National Provident Fund, which, however, allows the worker to have a very low, about $17 per month, which is very little and obviously not enough. And finally, there is a regulation on wage, which provided the employer may lay off workers without pay due to reasons beyond his or her control for up to 14 days. Afterwards, either re-employ or terminate the contract. But again, because of the kind of limbo the firms put their workers on at a 50% without actually terminating their contract or letting them off, so the workers were kind of left in a situation where they couldn't even claim for the National Provident Fund, right? So that they had no choice. So to conclude, and like our conclusion is, first of all, that the structure of the value chains before the pandemic is very critical. We need to understand that if we want to understand how the pandemic impacted on firms and workers. And we showed that that is the most important difference between direct and indirect suppliers. Second, public governance by the Eswatini state has been largely ineffective in its response to COVID-19, and that's very much interconnected with the investment policy that they have been setting in place for the last 20 years. And finally, a question that we are trying to explore now is, why do we see this difference with North-South global value chains? As you know, most of the literature on North-South global value chain that came out in the early stages of the pandemic has shown the very opposite of what we have seen here for direct suppliers. So firms in the global North disengaged, they didn't pay for the contract, they didn't respect their contracts, actually didn't pay for orders that were already placed, with disastrous consequences for suppliers in Bangladesh and other countries. So why do we see that with direct suppliers in Eswatini, their buyers, their lead firms are more sympathetic and more supportive? This is a question that we are not able to answer at this stage, but it's something that we're trying to explore further. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, and thanks for keeping to time. So Soren, I see you've come back with another similar question, but a related question. So do you want to go ahead and raise your question?
Yeah, thanks, Steph, and thank Giovanni and Shane for a great presentation, very interesting. Yeah, it's coming out of work that I'm doing with a colleague in South Africa, Andres Bezuidenhout at University of Fort Hare, where we're comparing the South African with the Lesotho and the Eswatini garment sectors. And we see the same trends as you do also in terms of markets and so on. But I think on the Eswatini case, a lot of the issues on the labor side and for workers seems to come in this, you can say, struggle we have on maybe not so much related to the sector as much as more general issues between the king and the unions. And the companies have this, that if you're accepted to invest, you are considered to be a friend of the king. And that means that sort of you're kind of a little bit beyond criticism. And that obviously makes it a tough work for the unions to come in and do certain things. So it was sort of a little bit more on your kind of reflections and finding on that I was looking for. And yeah, as Steph says, also of course relates to the first presentation and these talks about sort of role of the state in various ways. Thank you.
Giovanni, do you want to?
Sure, and Shane, feel free to step in if you want. So I perfectly agree with you. In fact, I didn't mention it in the presentation, but ATUSWA, which is the main aggregate union for the apparel sector, they have been cut out of the present last summer negotiation of how to use the different public policy options that I described. There was a negotiating table where ATUSWA was literally not present. It was just between the employer association and the state. So it is indeed true. And they've, the kind of factories we have visited, well, all of them, very few were unionized. The unions were having a very hard time to enter these factories, despite having more than 50% of the workers supporting the union. They still were facing with major barriers, both from the employers association, but most importantly from the government. I don't know, Shane, if you want to add something to that.
Yeah, thanks, Soren. I will. I'm clearly, Eswatini is a very particular state in that it's an absolute monarchy. And in many cases, as you said, if you're a foreign direct investor, you're seen as a friend of the king. In practice, sometimes they are very close friends of the king and donate lavishly to the Queen's various funds and so on. So it's very enmeshed, but I don't see it as very different from Lesotho or a number of other countries in the region that are absolutely desperate for foreign direct investment to catalyze development and create jobs. In both, in all those cases, they have a very they treated those foreign direct investors are treated with kid gloves and wield a lot of political power behind, closed doors and out of sight of researchers and whoever else. So it takes a particular form in Eswatini, but I don't see it as being particularly different from the sort of dynamic you'll find in other countries in the region. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah.
Right.
Thanks.
We've got an excellent question from Peter Lund Thompson about the relationship between global and regional value chains. My only concern is that this could be a 10-minute response. But also, Peter, I do think that this would be a really good question to raise for we're allowing 25 minutes, 30 minutes at the end. So could I ask you to park that question for the moment, but I'll come to that first when we get to the main discussion. Is that okay? In which case, should we go on to Margaret and Matthew's paper? Can you be doing the switch over while I introduce you? So this paper is by Matthew Alford and Margaret Visa, first from the University of Manchester, second from the University of Cape Town. And the paper looks at private governance overlapping global, regional and domestic value chains, the case of South African apples. So again, I'll give you 5 minutes warning and then 2 minutes warning.
Can you see my screen?
Yep, and we can hear you fine.
Good. Hi, so my name is Margriet Visser. I'm from the Development and Governance Research Unit at the University of Cape Town. And this research was conducted with Dr. Matthew Alford of the Alliance Manchester Business School at the University of Manchester. Just also to say that this is a work in progress, so we are looking forward to your feedback at the end of the session. So previous studies under the GVC and GPN banner have explored the private governance of labour standards. In other words, codes of conduct standards demanded by lead firms in the global north from suppliers in the global south. And this came about following pressure from consumers and civil societies based in the UK and Europe. More recent work shows that there has been a shift in end markets from the global north to the global south, which has important implications for the governance of labour standards. Some people think this will mean a race to the bottom for labour standards due to a lack of civil society pressure and/or consumer demand in the global south. Other studies paint a more mixed picture, showing that there are in fact standards in the global south already, albeit perhaps less stringent and more variable in form. Drawing on global value chain and global production network analysis, this paper contributes to these debates by firstly asking to what extent will the decreasing supply of fruit to northern relative to southern production networks lead to a decline in labour standards. And then our theoretical question is, how have interactive processes of embeddedness shaped the governance of labour standards in overlapping production networks? Our empirical focus is on the governance of labour standards on South African fruit farms serving overlapping domestic, regional, south-south and north-south production networks. So if we can situate market shifts and changing standards within a theoretical context, we feel that because of market differentiation potentially impacting on the government of GVCs, Gereffi et al.'s 2005 typology of global value chains are quite useful. They used 3 factors: the complexity of transactions, the ability to codify transactions, and the capability of suppliers to identify 5 types of chains and 5 types of networks At the one end of the spectrum was market change, which is arm's length, and then on the other side of the spectrum, hierarchical chains, which they view as vertically integrated. In the middle of those three are three types of network change, which is market, modular, relational, and captive. And we are specifically interested in market, modular, and captive chains. Now, Gereffi and et al. Argued that as one moves from market to hierarchical chains, the degree of explicit coordination and power asymmetry rises from low to high. What is interesting also is that if you look at both market and modular, they have fairly low switching costs for suppliers, which will become significant in the later discussion of this paper. Gereffi and colleagues pointed out that modular chains are on the rise worldwide, and in these chains, buyers, so-called lead firms, exert control over a distance via standards. However, the same standards, importantly, also enable producers to switch more easily to other buyers, diminishing their beholdenness to buyers. Nadvi et al. Argued that there are three types of standards that are used by lead firms to coordinate and control their suppliers. These standards are product standards, process standards, and social standards. While Gereffi et al. Acknowledged the influence of institutions, geography, and social context on GVC governance, they prefer to park these factors in order to isolate the key variables that impact on how firms and group of firms are linked together in GVC. The Global Production Network framework, however, questioned this approach, and scholars like Henderson, Hess, and Co. argued that economic action is always grounded in societal structures, and that governance in GVC or GPN, as they would have it, cannot be disentangled from societal structures. And so to explain the impact of these societal structures on GVC, Hess, 2004, identified three types of embeddedness. The first type is societal embeddedness. Briefly, it's take notes of the societal norms, politics, and cultures that shape network actors' actions. Network embeddedness, which describes the network between actors regardless from which countries or societies they are from, which is perhaps most closely aligned to the GV concept of a chain between firms. And then territorial embeddedness, which refers to the fact that actors become anchored into the institutions, such as the regulatory framework of the state, in the spaces where they operate. While the concept of embeddedness has been criticized for being somewhat fuzzy, scholars like Hughes and my colleague, Dr. Alford, have used the concept of embeddedness to explain the absence or presence of social standards in end markets in the global north. However, we know very little about the embeddedness of producers, such as those in South Africa, in multiple networks across the global north and south, which comprise multiple end markets, and how these will impact on the governance of labor standards. Okay, I now go to the methodology of our study. This research was carried out in 2018 and 2021. It was impacted by COVID. We could not, in the end, do face-to-face interviews with producers and workers. During the time when we did our research with key stakeholders, we were fortunately still able to conduct face-to-face interviews. The first phase of our research consisted of a mapping exercise, mapping the domestic, regional, and south-south and northern apple production networks. It consisted of desktop research and then key stakeholder interviews, which amounted to about 30 interviews. From the information we collected during key stakeholder interviews, we then pinpointed 10 case studies, and we interviewed 10 producers, 60 workers, and in total we interviewed about 100 people. We tried to choose case studies where apple producers would export to northern markets, and so to the whole gamut of different markets. But then we also tried to pick case studies where producers might maybe only export to the global south and to regional markets, or only domestically. But it was sometimes difficult to find such producers, as will become clear later.
You've got approximately 5 minutes.
Thank you. So what is the split of apple production from South Africa? At the moment, 45% exported, 30% go for juicing, and 25% go to local markets. If we look at the global north, end markets, the global north, the whole change of shifting end markets over time, end markets for South African apple exports have changed dramatically, as we can see from this slide. 10 years ago, the UK, the EU, and Russia were the main market for South African apple exports. And in 10 years' time, to that block, the percentage of apples exported declined from 46 to 34%. During the same time, production exports to Africa and the Middle East and East Africa increased from 50% to 62%. We don't have time to go into the drivers of these shifts due to time constraints, but it is linked to product and process upgrading of northern apple suppliers, which closed opportunities for South African farmers to supply European markets during the Northern Hemisphere off-season. Despite the smaller growing volumes going to the UK and the EU, for now these markets remain important due to the premium prices they pay. If you go to the slide, if you look at the yellow, you can see that the UK supermarkets pay much more, 25 Rand per kilogram, whereas if you go to the Johannesburg National Fresh Produce Market, you only get 4 Rand for the same. Well, importantly, it's not the same apple. Because on the Johannesburg market, you will buy a local class 1 or 2, and it's called you will buy a Crips pink apple, which is exactly the same cultivar of apple as Pink Lady, but it doesn't meet the adequate product standards to qualify for being sold as a Pink Lady. So the market, the national market, would typically sell local class 1, 2, and then either very small sizes or very large sizes. Market differentiation has not only made producers less beholden to the northern suppliers, but also allow them to sell their whole crop for the highest price. So if you take the example of a farmer, he cannot only produce Pink Lady because Pink Ladies get ripe on the same time, and he has to spread his labor use throughout the year. And to do that, he plants a different range of cultivars, and not all those cultivars are equally popular. UK and EU supermarkets mostly prefer so-called club varieties, the higher end varieties and the very top product. So what do you do if you're a farmer and you also have Golden Delicious, less popular varieties, and also fruit of a lowest class and smaller sizes or bigger sizes. So here market differentiation is critical because it allows you to sell your whole or as much of your harvest for the highest price instead of sending it to juice, which would barely cover your production costs.
You've got 2 minutes.
Okay. So if we look at the different markets, the important point that I want to point out here, of all the different markets, the domestic sector, there are some retailers in the domestic markets, and then there are retailers in the EU and UK markets. There are retailers in other markets as well, but they don't dominate. And what is important, only the UK and the EU has retailers that require social standards. At this stage, South Africa does not have, or South African supermarkets do not demand social standards. Sorry. So if we look at this slide, then what are the bearing, or what bearing does the theory discussion that we had earlier on have on our study? In terms of the apple GVC stretching from South Africa to the rest of the world, we see a movement over time from market governance, pre-deregulation, to captive governance, post-deregulation, to modular governance, and now to modular and market governance. Market diversification is partly a result of South African producers upgrading due to their insertion into Northern GPN. They are functionally upgraded and marketing their fruit in all regions. The rise of local supermarkets have also offered them the opportunity to supply fruit year-round. Due to market diversification, South African producers are therefore less beholden to northern buyers, with some even commenting that they are purposefully trying to wean themselves off northern markets. At this stage, Northern GPN remain important for those who can meet their high entry barriers due to the premium prices that they offer in those markets. Those who cannot meet these higher entry barriers now have more options to sell their fruit elsewhere. So yeah, just to point out again, in this slide then the brown circles are the domestic markets, the blue circle is northern markets, yellow circle regional markets, and southern markets. And of all these, the blue arrows indicate market chains. The purple arrows indicate modular chains. So the modular chains is to the EU and UK and retail in South Africa. The EU and UK chain is the only chain with modular chains that demand social standards.
Can you wrap up now?
Sorry?
Could you wrap up soon?
Yeah, sure. So what we see is that because producers are the common denominator in this picture, because they're integrated into EU, UK markets, and the same producers also supply retailers in South Africa as well as traders in Africa and the Middle East and municipal markets. You would get EU and UK social standards by default spilling over into these regional and southern markets at this stage. The danger is, however, that if EU and UK trade becomes less and less important, and maybe that this purple and red arrow might disappear completely, that we might sit with a social with a social standard deficit, and that might have grave impact for labor. We already see that there is maybe less importance given to social standards, as it seems to us that there's been a decline over time in producers being certified against social standards in South Africa. I will conclude with that.
Great, thank you very much, Margaret. Have we got questions? I haven't got any in the chat, but Giovanni, did you want to ask a question? Do you want to ask it, given you've put it into the chat button?
Sure, yeah, I can ask it too. So I wanted to know whether you can maybe spell out a bit more the role of the state, in this case, the South African government, I understand, in shaping the market and modular change in the domestic value chains, right? So the left side of this you just described, and if there is any at all, and then how is that different from the role of the state that we have seen so far in traditional global value chains with Europe?
Giovanni, sorry, I haven't had time. I ran out of time. But what I wanted to say also in conclusion is that this paper is part of a twin paper that will deal exclusively with, well, not exclusively, but will really hone in on public governance. So this is the second paper. For this paper, because the story is very complex, we decided to, at this stage, split the two topics into private governance and public governance. So unless, Matthew, I don't know if you want to come in there.
Well, can I come in here as chair, because we've run over into the next paper, so I just need to be careful of time. But I think this issue of the state is a really important discussion, and Soren raised it earlier. So could I suggest we park, particularly given your paper didn't focus on the state specifically, we park it for the moment, Judith, and then after the final paper, there are two topics that have come up, the state and this shift between GVCs and RVCs and how we analyse that. And I think this is an important discussion for all the papers. So is that okay if we park it for a minute? Peter, you had a quick question. Do you want to just quickly ask your question and then we move to the next paper?
Yes, thank you for the very nice presentation. I was wondering why there has been apparently a decline in social certification in South Africa in recent years. Maybe
why there has been a decline?
Yeah, if I understood you correctly, that was what you were saying, but maybe I didn't get it correctly, or maybe I didn't hear correctly.
No, it is the case, and we would posit that it's exactly because not all producers are any longer exporting to the EU and the UK, because those markets have prohibitively high, high product, process and social standards. So instead of going that route, producers instead send their fruit to the Middle East and the Far East, which give really good prices, but don't demand the same high standards. So you don't need the social standards to supply those markets.
I think it's really important to say very briefly, though, Peter, that as Marguerite said in the presentation, there are still social standards because the UK currently and the EU retain an important buyer role. So this is a shift that is in motion, if you like. So there are a number of question marks that surround what Marguerite's just said and what we presented going forward, if that makes sense. I think if you would agree, Marguerite, as well with that.
Yes.
But is that a trend across industries or only in this particular industry?
I think Apple's is quite far advanced because they have, to some extent, been kicked out of EU and EU markets. But it's a process also in other fruit.
I'd like to move on now, but I think we should come back to this in the general discussion because this raises a bigger issue. This is a shift from global to more regional value chains, or South-South trade going to undermine decent work. So I'm going to keep those three. We've got three big questions to ask in the bigger discussion. So Judith, could you set your, so the final paper is Judith Krause and colleagues. And the paper is What Makes Value Chains Resilient, the Importance of Civic-Minded Stakeholders in Coping with COVID-19 in Rural Mozambique. And again, 15 minutes, but you don't want me to give you a time warning, do you?
I've got a stopwatch, so unless I go over the 15 minutes, then just please mute me or something.
That's fine.
Thanks ever so much, Giovanni, Stephanie, Matthew, for organizing this panel. It's a pleasure to be part of it today. This is a paper that I've co-written with 4 colleagues focusing on the charcoal and baobab value chains and the livelihood impacts as a result of COVID-19 in rural Mozambique. But our paper has come out of a much bigger collaboration, the livelihood impacts of coping with COVID in rural Africa project that was funded by the University of Edinburgh's Global Challenges Research Fund allocation. And it brought together a variety of institutions from Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and the UK, building on long-standing partnerships because the money had to be spent fairly quickly, and it had to be spent on COVID impacts in the Global South. We focused on both livelihood impacts, but also information and communication channels relating to COVID, as well as then later on coping strategies in conjunction with COVID. We conducted 441 phone panel interviews with 92 panelists between May and July of 2020, so fairly early in the pandemic. And as part of that research, something that came out very strongly as being relevant in shaping livelihood impacts were the value chains that our panelists were part of. So in this paper, we chose to focus on 2 related research questions. Firstly, how the baobab and charcoal value chains were affected by COVID, particularly in terms of producer livelihoods. And then secondly, what we can learn from those experiences for building value chains that are resilient for the most vulnerable value chain actors. And our main argument here is that value chain stakeholders with civic-based priorities safeguarded more resilient livelihoods under COVID, including for women. Our conceptual framework brings together livelihood vulnerability and resilience literatures with the value chain literature. We talk about value chains, even though following many others, including Nielsen and Pritchard, we draw on both global value chains and global production networks concepts. We are interested in cross-border processes, the division of labor, and modes of integration into markets and value chains. And we focus particularly here on domestic, regional manifestation vis-a-vis global manifestations of value chains, with a particular emphasis also on the relational nature of value chains. We draw firstly on convention theory, so the idea that the qualities that determine understandings and negotiations within value chains will have implications all the way through the value chains in market-based regimes. The predominant determinant is the price. In industry-based value chains, it's all about being able to certify and standardize. In civic-based regimes, there are strong priorities relating to socio-environmental production conditions and ethical conduct. We equally focus on power, using, on the one hand, the global production networks conceptualization of corporate, institutional, and collective power, and Phillips's ideas on market asymmetries around market power, social power, and political power, and those asymmetries. What we realized, however, in using those understandings of power was that they were quite significantly focused around lead firms. In our paper, however, we were trying to focus particularly around the local level and non-lead firm actors and their relevance in shaping these value chains. So our second key literature is livelihood, vulnerability, and resilience, understanding livelihood as a likelihood, understanding vulnerability as the likelihood of experiencing harm due to being exposed to hazards, and then acknowledging also that specifically in sub-Saharan Africa, there are significant pre-existing levels of vulnerability due to interrelated structural factors, while understanding livelihoods with Chambers and Conway as the means to make a living with a particular focus on the rural context. The relational focus of global production networks here chimes with the nested and interrelated scales in livelihood vulnerability and resilience. And we focus particularly on livelihoods dependence on the degree of market and value chain integration. We also take from the vulnerability and resilience literature focus on risk, as well as on diversification, because risk is not as prominent in the value chain literature, maybe somewhat surprisingly, compared with the vulnerability and resilience literature. In terms of our research design and methods, out of our overall sample, we used for this paper 273 interviews with 60 panelists over 3 to 7 study weeks. These are the interviews that occurred in the communities linked to the charcoal value chains, the Mabalane and Mapai areas, and then the Baobab value chain in the Guru and Tambara districts further north in Mozambique. And our interviews occurred at a time when all of Mozambique was subject to a state of emergency or calamity in terms of transport being limited or discontinued, trading restrictions being in place, and social distancing requirements being enforced across all public and private life. This required some methodological metamorphoses from our research team. We conducted phone panel questionnaires, interviews based on prior work done in those areas as well as in Zimbabwe. We tried to be responsive and adaptive in putting together those questionnaires to feedback from local partners as well as our research colleagues on the ground, who were the ones who made it all happen. We conducted those interviews in local languages, and then Portuguese summaries were coded and analyzed through NVivo 12. We started in the first week with some straightforward questions and answers in order to familiarize our panelists with the unfamiliar environment of being interviewed over the phone, but then opened it up in subsequent weeks somewhat. Through weekly team calls with all 15 researchers involved in the project, we were able to co-devise and then revise the study questionnaires and maintain data-led analysis throughout. And we also, amongst other things, through these weekly team calls, ended up revising questionnaires for the final 2 weeks to have more of a focus on risk and community responses based on feedback that we'd received both from interviewers and our local partners. So the Baobab value chain, this resonates with Giovanni and Shane's paper in that what happened pre-COVID and what was in place pre-COVID definitely had an impact on what happened during COVID. So pre-COVID in Baobab, the only formal buyer is Baobab Products Mozambique, a social enterprise that has that buys Baobab fruits from women collectors, only women collectors, and then sells organic Baobab powder to Europe. Their understanding of quality is very much civic-based, so prioritizing socio-environmental considerations, and Baobab is in this region a key livelihood source alongside some grains and peanuts. However, during COVID, quite a few of those livelihoods were eliminated for different reasons. BPM had to make some adjustments to maintain operations and maintain those livelihoods, including displaying information about COVID in their collection centers and safeguarding social distancing. European buyers from a very early point in the pandemic basically pulled out. And given this market collapse because of institutional restrictions on retail in Europe, BPM then was able to negotiate an interest-free loan from the donor via the Mikaya Foundation, so equally a civic-based stakeholder that was using institutional power to safeguard the maintenance of those livelihoods under COVID. And as you can see in these two quotes from our sample, the women collectors were very grateful that Baobab sale was able to continue, especially since lots of other livelihoods were no longer available under COVID, and they were dependent on this income. So there was effectively an alliance between a socially oriented, firm stakeholder that was drawing on the collective power of its beneficiaries to leverage the institutional and political power of a donor and replace the market power of European stakeholders that had backed out temporarily, though they re-entered the market later on. So the market power asymmetries that are still present in this chain definitely did not affect collectors adversely. The risk was effectively transferred away. They were protected. Those that were most vulnerable, the baobab collectors, were protected from bearing the brunt of these market asymmetries under COVID. Very different situation in the charcoal value chain. This is a key semi-formal economic sector and a crucial source of cash income in sub-Saharan Africa. This is, unlike baobab, a domestic value chain, so being produced at the small scale, at least that's what we're interested in for our study, and then sold to urban centers. There's no centralized buyer, and even prior to COVID, 90% of the value generation happened outside of the local communities, partly because associations where they do exist are powerless. During COVID, the government's transport restrictions discontinued trains, which meant that a key transport link was eliminated. For livelihoods, that meant one positive effect of COVID, that charcoal was being accepted in payment at stores and small shops simply because there was no more cash in circulation. There were 3 negatives, however, in terms of charcoal production, which is predicated on collaboration and mutual aid, which was no longer possible because of social distancing. Another negative was that the changed transport modalities made it very difficult for our small-scale producers to sell, to access sacks and rope for packaging the charcoal, and it put truck drivers into a very strong bargaining position vis-a-vis those small-scale producers. So that meant for our small-scale producers that they saw a reduction in overall volume of what was available for sale, and also what prices they were able to get for their charcoal. So as you can see from these 2 quotes, people talk about how the transport restrictions reduce both the prices and the volume that they are able to sell. And they also feel like they're getting ripped off because the prices paid to them are reducing. At the same time, prices for consumables, including food, are going up. So small-scale charcoal producers saw their selling opportunities restricted, and they bore effectively the full brunt of market power asymmetries between themselves and the urban charcoal retailers, and there was no collective power, no associations to contest the behavior of urban charcoal sellers. In terms of parallels between our 2 cases, they're both natural resources that are obtained from woodlands and forests. Their extraction remained viable even under COVID, as our panelists' lives were otherwise completely turned upside down. So they were a lifeline in difficult times, but they manifested quite differently. For both of them, there was heightened engagement from a gender viewpoint. Husbands suddenly became interested in supporting their wives' baobab collection. Conversely, on the charcoal side, wives started getting roped into producing charcoal simply because men could no longer call on other members of the community in mutual aid or collaboration networks. On the baobab side, there was a constant source of income through the pandemic. However, charcoal was only good enough to actually fend off hunger, but even that only in parts. There were panelists that talked about no longer knowing what to feed their children. So producers in both value chains were most at risk from or negatively affected by the COVID restrictions, but this translated very differently. So in terms of divergences, the civic-based priorities in baobab meant that the most vulnerable were protected. There was an alliance between socially minded stakeholders, both on the private sector and the public sector side. By contrast, in the domestic charcoal value chain, all it was about was prices. The higher returns that charcoal retailers were able to obtain in urban centers were not passed on to small-scale charcoal producers, and there was no way to contest that for our panelists. In terms of diversification of livelihoods, the strategy of diversification was quite different in terms of the success rate in a time of crisis between our two value chains. And there's also a clear difference in terms of sustainability. For charcoal, you physically have to cut branches or trees, whereas for baobab, you have to maintain the trees and you're just collecting fruit. So in conclusion, in the global baobab value chain, the civic-based understandings that reign safeguarded incomes. There was an opportunity to leverage the collective and social and the institutional and political powers to protect the most vulnerable actors. In the domestic charcoal value chain, by contrast, market-based understandings of quality reigned. There were much more uncertain livelihoods because of a lack of transport links, integration, and no collective or social power. There's definitely an opportunity for cross-chain learning around what factors, what association strategies might be viable to make the situation better for charcoal producers. And we also thought that there were some relevant conceptual questions coming out around combining these literatures, around integrating risk into value chain analysis, and around strengthening the local level investigation for value chain analysis. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, and very good timekeeping. Can we, are there any specific questions in the chat? Soren, you've raised the bigger question, and I'm just wondering, before we come to that, if there anybody who's got any points of clarification or specific questions, because then I think we should come back to this issue. There are three issues I think we should come back to in the general discussion. One relates to the state, and I think all of the papers are really interesting and raise issues linked to state. The other is Peter's question about global and regional value chains. How does our analysis cope with this? And the third is, what's the implications for labour? So just before we go, are there any other specific, Matthew, have you got a specific question for Judith?
I also have one.
Okay, so Matthew and Serena, and then I'll come back to you, Soren.
If this crosses into the general, I know we're pushed to time, and I think there's a really great opportunity for general discussion, so I'll be very brief. Judith, just a quick conceptual question. I loved the presentation, by the way, it was great. I was wondering, did you come across and feel any need to engage with or think about using the Dallas's framework on power? I know you've used a particular framework, but I know that's one that might help to move beyond the lead firm supplier linkages only. And I mean, it is a fairly complex typology, but nonetheless, that was one. And the other one was when you draw on Nicola's the different typologies of power, the market power, the kind of market asymmetries. I was kind of wondering who were the buyers across these two sectors. It felt like in charcoal, it was very much a wholesale kind of setup. With the other value chain, I wasn't as sure, but I know it's a kind of market power is based, unless I'm wrong, from Nicola's work on that power asymmetry between lead firm retailer or lead firm and supplier. So I was just wondering what that looked like across your cases. That's it. Sorry for the waffle.
I think Shane's got another specific question, Judith. Should he ask it, and then you could come back to them together? Shane, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Deb. Just very quickly, and I can't recall the earlier slides. Was the fieldwork for both chains carried out at exactly the same time? And I'm just wondering whether that might be a factor in some of the differences between the chains. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Judith, do you want to come back, and then we'll open the discussion up?
Yeah, I think Serena said she had a question. But
sorry, Serena, I missed you.
Yeah, I also had one. Yeah, no worries, that's fine. I'll just lower my hand. No, I just wanted to ask. I mean, this partly stems also from thinking about this in my own work in the construction sector. Do you think, from a conceptual point of view, do you think that there are certain sectors where the civic-based engagement, so the civic-based mechanism that you mentioned, do you think there are some sectors where this can come across more than in others? I mean, building on what Matt was also saying, does this depend then on the type of bias that you're facing, or does it, I mean, have you tried to conceptualize what other elements might this be connected to? Because, for example, in the construction sector, it is very hard to see how that might come across. It isn't surprising that you don't have that, because because essentially the buyers are buying homes in one case, or the buyers are the state in the other. So I don't know if, so like, maybe I'm just sort of thinking aloud, like, should we then be thinking more about how do we conceptualize that participation? What enables it more than in other cases?
Judith.
Okay, I'll start with the easy question. So yes, the research was conducted simultaneously across both of the value chains, as well as in other livelihoods that I didn't go into today because the focus is on 2 value chains. It was conducted between May and July of 2020. So all of the state interventions occurred at the same time, and affected, in theory, everybody the same. But as I mentioned, because the charcoal value chain relied very heavily on trains as transport links to urban centers, and had no backup plan, that they were more affected than the Baobab value chain, even though the restriction as such, the sort of the manifestation of institutional power was the same. Matthew, there are, I think, 2 different conceptualizations of power that I know from Dallas et al. On the one hand, the diffuse versus direct power, and then 2019, sort of the 4-fold conceptualization of bargaining, consultative, demonstrative, I believe. So I'm not entirely sure which one you're talking about. The reason
I don't fully understand it either. Sorry.
No, I'm just trying to understand which of the 2 lots
so they have the typology of direct diffuse, and then those 4 aspects that cut across the demonstrative, constitutive.
Okay.
And then it was really a basic question, because I'm trying and failing to use it in a different paper. I was wondering if it helped you at all, if you came across it, and if you considered using it at all or not in this paper. It was, yeah.
So we didn't use it. It might, I mean, we can certainly look into whether or not this helps. We found that these ideas of sort of alliance versus contestation were quite helpful in how we were conceptualizing our understanding. We were also trying to sort of reflect different ways of thinking about power in light of the specific local level insights from the vulnerability and resilience literature, which of course comes from a slightly different angle. And so I felt, at least so far, that there was sort of a bit more synthesis maybe, or a bit more kinship, but I'm happy to look into whether or not.
I fully understand. It was more an offhand question.
We've got some parked questions, so yeah, I think Judith, if you could just wrap up.
Yes, I'm happy to. I think there was a question about wholesale versus retailers in terms of charcoal versus Baobab. Yes, I mean, the market power asymmetries following Phillips did play a significant role, but the charcoal side of things, Baumert and colleagues have explored this in quite a bit of detail, is quite complex in terms of the interplay of wholesale and retail between small scale, medium sized and other producers, specifically in Mozambique. So on the Baobab side, it was this one formal buyer that was then selling into Europe, even though then some domestic buyers also eventually emerged as more and more focus was placed on health foods in the course of the pandemic. There was a question from Serena about whether this is sector specific. I think that's a very interesting question that I need to think about more. We didn't, because we haven't got sort of the comparative analysis across different countries or across different sectors. I wouldn't want to conclude anything on the basis of just this study. My sense is that this alliance of civic-based stakeholders between an institutional donor and then a social enterprise, in theory, could occur across different sectors, but it's probably easier in agriculture because the chains are shorter, and also you have some easy access to, oh, I'm sorry, I don't know why I'm so big now. I think you have access to some straightforward certification that then also makes a difference to end users in terms of, you know, buying organic baobab powder as opposed to something else. I'm not sure that that is the case in other sectors. I'd be very interested to hear what you have to say about construction in that regard. But thank you for the question.
Great. There is another question from Artie, but I think given time, I think maybe you'll have to look at that one to one. There's been a few. There have been 3 quite big cross-cutting questions, and don't forget we've got 3 panels. One of them is Soren's raised questions to virtually every paper in relation to the state. Another Peter raised in relation to one of the papers in relation to the link, the analytical relationship between global value chains and regional value chains. And then the third question that came up relates to labour and what are the implications of shifting south for labour. Now we can't deal with all of them, but what I would just as chair recommend, I think, Soren, if you could come back. I think given this panel, the main theme was governance, and obviously state is a key actor in that whole governance agenda, which is often under examined in value chain literature. I wondered, Soren, if you could just pose your question generally, and then we'll ask each of the papers just to come back and briefly reflect on the implications. And I think that'll be about time, unfortunately. But we will continue this discussion tomorrow. Soren, did you want to come back?
Yeah, just briefly, thanks, Steph. Yeah, I agree with you that there is a tendency for this underrepresentation that we have, and I think with all due respect to great presentations and great papers here, but again, we can't deal with it all at once. But I certainly would like to hear more about the reflections from the presenters also here in terms of what has been the role of the state or lack of same. Because at least from also the earlier mentioned research that I've been involved with in Southern Africa, it's quite clear that this makes a heck of a lot of difference. If we take South Africa, I think earlier we kind of looked partly to South Africa because it was seen to some extent as a progressive labor regime after '94, and a state promoting that. Probably reality has since shown that this was a bit over optimistic, and if we take Garmin, for instance, this is certainly not the case anymore, or at least with a lot of differences. And also here, I think different levels of local state, whether national, regional, and local, also plays into that. So it was reflections on that I was looking for, and I think it's yeah, fruitful and important for these discussions. Thanks.
Great, thanks. So I think that's a really, I mean, the whole issue is really important. Serena, did you want to, in relation to your paper? Soren repeatedly asked a similar or related question in the chat, so but now I'm coming back to them all together.
Yeah. So the one that was related to mine in particular, I'm sorry that it didn't come across. I probably didn't emphasize enough, but not to the contrary. Yeah, I completely agree with you. I mean, the role of the state in the policy-making processes, I was emphasizing. I mean, there could be an active or omissive role, and so what I'm trying to say is that an omissive role is just as important. In this case, I was pointing to the role in terms of the reform of the legislation in terms of subcontracting specifically. So that's where I was identifying the role of the state coming in through the whole of this. It could be seen as facilitative, it could be seen as regulatory, but in many ways, the omission of that support is what essentially enabling the cascading process within our framework.
And Giovanni, we're going to have quite short, unfortunately, because we've already been warned our session is finishing soon.
Absolutely. I think that we entered into this kind of work with based on previous literature on GVC, clearly showing an outsourcing governance from state to large corporation. Of course, you have AGOA, where the US and other countries have participated and accepted certain rules, also for social governance, about workers, which is the reason why Eswatini in 2015 effectively was kicked out of AGOA, because they were not respecting freedom of association, which is part of a public governance at the global level, which comes from AGOA. So that's public governance too. So it really depends. When we talk about public governance, I think we should add the layers of public governance: the global one, and the domestic one, the supplier one and the buyer one. So when it comes to RVC, what is the public governance here? Again, is South Africa, which has increased the role of public governance so much to increase, for example, minimum wages to push manufacturing into Eswatini and Lesotho in the first place, where the public governance was pretty much lacking or very ineffective and largely driven by investment policy to attract FDIs. So again, I think I finish it there, but I think that these are what I would like to stress.
Margaret, just some brief.
Yeah, what's very interesting.
Before we cut off.
Yeah, what was interesting to us is if you look, the state has historically and ongoing played a very significant role in monitoring the upholding of product and on our process standard, but not the same level social standard. The social standards, private standards have arisen precisely because there has been, the state has lacked the capacity to enforce it. So although, yes, it has ostensibly a good and a progressive labor regime, although we would argue that it's no longer the case because it's fallen behind the kind of whole casualization and externalization. It's not dealing with that at all. The state, it's not giving the same attention to the upholding of labor standards than it is giving attention to upholding of process and product standards.
Yeah, interesting point. And Judith, if you just some reflections on the state in relation to your paper.
Yeah, just very quickly, as I think I pointed out, the institutional power of the state was, of course, very much felt as a result of the COVID restrictions that were implemented under the state of emergency in end of March, beginning of April of 2020, and that remained in force all the way through our interview period. They had sort of diverse repercussions, but it was very much present, and numerous panelists also talked about why can't the government give us food and things like that. So there were sort of those kinds of interventions, but not the positive kind of interventions, unlike some other contexts. And of course, then the state was also present through an institutional donor from another country that then did give an interest-free loan to maintain the baobab value chain. I'm not very well positioned to comment on regional value chains. What I do think, however, is that from what we were trying to do in focusing very much on the local level and the livelihoods, I do think that there is some opportunity to strengthen the attempt to look at value chains sort of from the local level that people like Arti Krishnan have also tried to do, and sort of look at it from the producer level rather than from the lead firm level. And I do think that would have quite a few implications. And of course, that would then also work for labor, looking at it from the worker level rather than the producer level. Thanks very much for all your questions. Much
Thanks. And we've got 1 or 2 minutes left. Anybody else want to come in on this issue of the state? We're going to get cut off. I'm very aware of that because of Zoom. They have control over us. But any quick reflections?
Maybe just very briefly. Just on behalf of Marguerite and in response to our paper, in response to Soren's excellent points, I think there's something really important that we're seeing. We presented the private governance story in this particular paper and all of its complexity and the shift from the global north to regional, domestic and south-south chains, and a potential problem with that insofar as social standards diminishing. The issue is is that the South African government, as Marguerite presented, is playing a key regulatory role within South Africa in terms of governing product, process, and social standards to a point. However, it's not able at the moment to enforce that, and so that's why private standards have been complementing that and coming in. The big question mark we have, and what we were quite surprised, civil society within South Africa is not putting pressure on the right levers on the state to put the pressure on domestic retailers. If markets continue to shift south, that's a potential problem. So the state can and should play a really central regulatory role, but there is a danger that we're seeing in the South African context that role in terms of labor regulation, social standards is diminishing. It's something we're going to explore in a separate companion paper. And I know Steph and Gio have excellent observations on this in the Kenyan context in another paper. Just to add that, Steph.
We've been informed by, it's on the chat, but we've been informed by the tech support that we can carry on a bit longer. Should I suggest, just for those who are interested in continuing this discussion, another 10 minutes? I mean, people might have other things to peel off for anyway. I'm happy to carry on if people would like to. Anybody else want to come in on this issue of the state?
If I may, just following on Matthew's point, I think also here, when we take a closer look at the state, for instance, the South African one there, that it has come in, it has the powers to do certain things, but I think there's also an issue, at least if we look at garments, in terms of that it used to have also much more, you can say, knowledge and capacity with regard to, we can say, okay, so what are working conditions, labor standards, and so on in the industry, and how do we deal with them, and how do we ensure, you can say, both to move on with quality, efficiency, and so on, but also ensure sort of better on the working conditions. And like these, our studies show that there's been a brain drain there, and means that they're kind of delinked from what's going on. So this becomes something which is very general in what they do, and on the sector, it seems like that they, as I also wrote in my comment, that they're kind of then also to some extent pushing a lot of this into informality. And this means that you're just getting actually worse working conditions, because it means that wages go down, and it's completely unregulated. So I think there's an important aspect there about, you can say, the quality of regulation also on the public side, and what kind of competences that we have or do not have. Thank you.
Peter, are you still with us? Did you want to relate this discussion to that issue of the relationship between global and regional value chains?
No, I was just thinking that, I wanted to ask Giovanni if he sees there's any need for changing of key concepts around governance, power, upgrading, institutional context, when we move from the global value chain analysis to maybe the analysis of regional value chains.
Does anyone else want to come in on that point?
Can I make a comment? Well, I think what is apparent to us is that we're in global value chains. There are clear lead firms that govern these modular chains. That what we see in the regional chains, not so much in South Africa, because here we have strong retail, strong consolidated retail base. But in Africa, very much, and also to some extent in the Middle East and the East, producers say they're dealing with traders, and a variety of traders. So it's that consolidated lead firm power that forms the kingpin of the governance theories missing. And so, how do you conceptualize that in a regional chain governance?
If I can just come in on that point from, I mean, we've now gone beyond our time, so this is just an open discussion. But just in terms of research that we've been doing in Kenya, and I will report on that a bit more tomorrow, I think we also need to differentiate between governance of what, because certainly on the agri-food side, I mean, Margaret, you distinguished between product process and social standards. So on the agri-food side in Kenya, definitely I would say it's difficult, but public governance hasn't really played a particularly strong role on the social side at all. And there's an argument that could be made, research is still ongoing, that has weakened. But on the product side in relation and process in relation to food, problems of food quality are now increasingly with urbanization, not only affecting exports, but affecting the domestic market. And the state has almost been forced to intervene on that. So I think, yeah, I think we need to kind of just differentiate a little bit about what it is that we're looking at the state in relation to, and differentiate between decent work and workers and others. Anybody else who wants to come in on these points?
I can very briefly on Peter's point of upgrading in regional value chains and global value chains, which you briefly touched upon. But of course, as we were looking at COVID just before and after COVID, it's a bit hard to monitor an upgrading trend, which by default is something that happened over time and not in a cross-sectional sort of analysis. So of course, I think, you know, if you take the previous research that is there from Cornelia Staris, that shows that in regional value chains there is outsourcing of a bit more of more activities to regional producers in these countries, with the possibility of also making more gains. Is there something we see there? Hard to say, because in Eswatini, everybody, when we looked at it, already shifted to the regional market. However, we don't say that in the paper, but we do not find any evidence that they are performing more activities, either upstream or downstream. So that type of upgrading, we don't really see. What we, however, see is the outcome of upgrading, which should normally be understood in making more money, you know, at the end of the day, of economic upgrading. And yes, and most of these firms, even though Eswatini was admitted back into AGOA in 2018, of all the firms we talked to who had been in AGOA up to 2015, none of them wanted to go back. They utterly refused to go back to export to the US because they were making better profit and more money with South Africa. End of the story. So that's very interesting. And that goes into why they were, well, probably because the South African market is heavily protected from exports from competitor countries such as Bangladesh, and I think it's a 40% tariff to access. That could be the case, but yeah.
Interesting. Any other views or comments or reflections on this topic?
I just thought very quickly about what you said, Steph, about the type of regulation being important. And I think what myself and Marguerite saw is that almost, and using that Mayer and Phillips typology that was used in an earlier presentation, it's almost as though we're seeing facilitative regulation being very important in terms of the South African state in the agricultural sector. We saw in encouraging exports, both regionally, globally, etc. But that protective distributive regulation lacking, and that's the big danger, where you have a private governance moving away, and that lack of public governance protection, even though theoretically you'd think the state might be better placed to regulate lead firms within its own jurisdiction. We weren't seeing that, and that was a cause for some concern and something we're going to explore in a companion paper. But I was making that connection between the Kenyan and South African case, and it is very interesting.
Okay, so I think we've already run over. Quite a few people are slowly peeling off. So unless there's any other we will have the 2 sessions tomorrow. Don't forget, very important, more focused on labour, 10 to 11:45 in the morning, and then 2:15 to 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So I think we will be able to continue this discussion. This is the great advantage of having a kind of different number of sessions, so we can continue and roll over. And to get the discussion going, I'm sorry if I've been a bit strict on the chairing on the time, but it's really good to allow time for this kind of discussion. So I think unless there's any other pressing points, I think we will continue tomorrow. And such a shame that we're not physically together, because we could have all gone for a nice cup of tea and continued, or a drink, but we can't.
Indeed. We'll have to find another time for that. But thanks a lot, Steph, and thanks for the
Definitely.
presentation.
No,
See you tomorrow. Look forward
thanks
to
for
that.
presentations, and thanks to everyone.